and we're trying to unfold the meaning of it. So today, as luck would have it, we have no women attendees. We may have some online, but we've just come up with this program for characterizing the monthly program as dedicated to a given ancestor. Next month is Nagarjuna. Those of you who are more philosophical, intellectually oriented, you'll find that interesting. Nagarjuna was 14th in India. Bodhidharma was 28th, so Nagarjuna was halfway through. So several years ago, the Soto Zen Buddhist Association, to which I belong, some of the rest of us do, is kind of an organization of American Zen priests and Soto Zen. And it's, I would say, 50-50 male-female, roughly. I'm not sure, I haven't done the count, but there seem to be as many women priests present as men priests generally. And an issue came up. They raised an issue, several people, not just the women, but there are a lot of female ancestors in the history of Zen who have never talked about, hardly ever mentioned. And so being a graphic designer as well as industrial design, I was asked to, I can't remember if I volunteered or they asked for people to help come up with some sort of a certificate for this. And so I developed several designs for that. And there was a research committee with some of the intellectual scholars and so forth that were digging into this, going back to what they call prehistory, and then the record is recorded in India. And I can't remember, there's at least maybe 15 or 20 in that record. And then going to China, there's a lot more. And then going to Japan, there's just a ton. And then in modern times, there are so many leading up to modern times. So it turns out there's quite a history there, but they have these brief mentions in the literature. And Maha Pajapati, for instance, is the one we named this month after, and she was, as I understand, Shakyamuni's mother. But I don't know that there's a lot of material on her. So I went to Japan to take the second one, the Keizan's mother, and emphasize her today as well. And when they came up with this idea of, I said, well, Mahapajapati probably won't find enough material, but let's make January all the Indian women ancestors month, and then we'll see what material we can find. And then in a couple months from now, it's going to be Japan. But for today's talk, I thought, because I couldn't find enough material around India, I found material on Keizan's mother, brief mentions, and I want to put it in a context of a broader principle of Master Dogen taught of recognition of Dharma holders, whether they be male, female, from different class or status in life and so forth, it doesn't matter. Has nothing to do with social kind of status. So I think it's a broader general principle, and I think that's what I want to emphasize today. So I'm hoping I don't have too much material to cover here. I want to read some quotes to you. This is a little bit more like a book report talk, and I don't usually do this, most of you who know me. So this is a book by Paula Arai, who is a famous, well-known within the Zen community, woman who has done a lot of research on Soto Buddhist nuns, especially Dogen's nuns. She came to a conference we held at Emory in 2000, and she gave a slide presentation, a talk on Dogen's nuns, and how this one of his lineage, a nun in 1945, petitioned the Sotoshu Parliament to recognize all of the female nuns, all the nuns. And she based it on this fascicle we'll be taking a quick look at today, Rai Hai Tokuzui, which means something like prostration to the attainment of the marrow. And this fascicle is related to an incident, a story, an anecdote, who knows the historicity of it, that Bodhidharma, when he was dying, had his 4 main successors there, and he had them each say something about their understanding. He's on his deathbed. It was of Zen, or Buddhism. So the first one steps forward and says something. He says, "You have my skin." I think this way. Yeah, "You have my skin." The next one steps forward and says something and says, "You have my flesh." And the next one steps forward and says something, says, "You have my bones." And the last one just steps up, bows, and steps back in place. And he says, you have my marrow, my marrow." So this is often interpreted as the last person who became his successor, Huike, I think I pronounced that correctly, had the marrow, so he had the deepest understanding. But Dogen and others point out that you can't separate skin, bone, marrow, flesh. They don't separate. So this is not representing deeper degrees of understanding. This is just representing the whole package, right? So each of you have this, and this. That's the whole thing. So prostrating to the attainment of the marrow is referring to that story, that anecdote. And in Rahi Tokuzui, he talks about prostrating to anyone who is a Dharma holder, no matter what their status. So it's not just male, female, but as in most cultures and societies, including today, that's one of the biggest splits we have. The gender split is one of the biggest sources of controversy. So I'll read as quickly as I can, and if anybody has a question, just stop me. She goes to say, as with much of Japanese Buddhism and culture, the Japanese turned to the Chinese for inspiration and guidance. Dogen urges the Japanese to continue the equality accorded women and men in China, especially in regard to recognizing the true Dharma in female form. Now, I think most of us would assume there's not much gender equality in China, right? Most of us would make that assumption, but apparently there was. So she's quoting Dogen here in a quote from the Rahi Tokuzui, which we will revisit a little bit. In the case of a nun, this is Dogen, in the case of a nun who has received the treasury of the true Dharma I through transmission, if the monks of the 4 fruitions, Pratyeka Buddhas, and even those of the 3 wise stages and of the 10 holy states pay homage to her and seek the Dharma from her, she should receive their obeisance. By what right are only males noble? The empty sky is the empty sky. The 4 elements are the 4 elements. The 5 skandhas are the 5 skandhas. To be female is exactly the same. For the attainment of the way, both male and female can attain the way. Hence, both should have high regard for the attainment of the Dharma, and not argue about differences between male and female. Such is the most marvelous law of the Buddha Dharma, of the Buddha way. So she goes on to say, Dogen includes an even more direct criticism of the practices he finds in Japan in a version of the Raihai Tokuzui found in the 28th fascicle of the Himitsu Shobogenzo, the secret Shobogenzo. So we'll touch on that a little bit. So then she goes into this scholarly assumption or presumption that when Dogen retired, or not retired, but when he finally moved to the monastery Eheiji, his views on women-men equality changed. And, scholars have this problem that they have to find new truths in the same material everybody else has studied. And so they'll bring these things out and debate these. So she goes on to say that Dogen never wrote that women had to become men to be enlightened, although this was a common notion during his time. Dogen also did not criticize the Lotus Sutra, which deals with this subject. On the contrary, in the Raihei Tokozui, he takes the story of princess becoming a Buddha and equates it with a 7-year-old girl becoming teacher to a 100-year-old monk. And we'll hear that. So she's quoting a passage from Women, Religion, and Sexuality that she says succinctly articulates the other interpretation. And she quotes several scholars here. When Dogen was young, he believed in the equality of men and women and criticized the foolishness of the Mount Hiei and Mount Koya temples, which barred women from entering. However, in later years, by the time Dogen built Eiheiji Temple, he no longer believed in the equality of men and women and prohibited their entry. Another scholar reinforces, this is now Paula talking, another scholar reinforces the interpretation that Dogen had a change of heart towards women. She claims that Dogen's move to Eiheiji is a good example of a case in which Buddhist celibate monasticism functioned in practice to prevent women's access to one of the greatest Zen teachers in history. So I always assumed that celibacy in Zen was for simplicity. It's a lot simpler than trying to have men and women and relationships and so forth within the context of what we're trying to do that's nearly impossible already, right? Let alone with the complications. And as I understand, that was some of the argument in the early days when Ananda, who was, I think, cousin to Shakyamuni, cousin to Buddha, he lobbied for women to be allowed into the original order in India. And before Buddha died, apparently their parliament met and passed a resolution to allow that to happen. But I think for the same reasons, there are a lot of what do you call it, cultural memes and so forth associated with this that you could understand would be reasons why. But from a Zen perspective, I think it's just might have been a matter of simplicity. Why do we have men's night, men's retreat, right? Women's night, women's retreat, just to keep that at least one level of complexity out of the mix. So she goes on to say, in the face of the sheer number of passages in Dogen's text that develop his positive view of women versus the one sentence to the contrary, especially given that the sentence appears in a text revised after Dogen's death, the case for Dogen reversing his views of women is weak. To offer the compromise that Dogen did not change his stance philosophically, but he just decided it was impractical to have women practicing Eiheiji does not resolve the issue. The historical record does not support such an interpretation. Funaoka Makoto, scholar apparently, interprets the two facets of Dogen's text as nothing more than emphasizing different things at different times in different conditions. He notes that things written at Eiheiji were written to an exclusive audience of renunciants, young monks, and older monks too. Some had a difficult time enduring this life. They had to sit in the cold like this all the time, by the way, in the winter. So emphasis on the high value of renunciation would have encouraged the practitioners. And we hear that in the Dogen ceremony where he's talking about leaving home as being such a high valuable thing. In our case, we're lay practitioners, so we only leave home symbolically, or we understand that homelessness is our true home. Right? We don't leave behind family and business, and we don't do that. But they did in the monastic tradition. Pretty extreme. This is in stark context to the earlier text from Koshoji period when Dogen was working among laity. Funaoka argues that Dogen's writings have contradictions that he plays out differently at different times. They cannot be construed to mean that he went from thinking laity can be enlightened to thinking that only renunciants can, even though some of his terminology sounds like that. Nor that he thought women could be enlightened and then later decided that women's enlightenment was not true. So as recorded in the Eihei Senso Gyoki, Senso Gyogoki. Dogen also received significant patronage from women. This is an important point. In the history of Zen in China, India, and Japan, women were the ones who got the guys to cough up the cash to pay for the practice, pay for the buildings, and so forth. The most renowned was Shogaku Zenni, who donated the funds to construct the Dharma hall at Dogen's first monastery, Koshoji. Apparently, she was a distant relative of Dogen's through his mother, of Fujiwara, apparently royal family. She was ordained on September 3rd, 1225, after her husband, that was about the time Dogen went to China. After her husband, Minamoto Sanetomo, died, she chose to devote her life and her riches to Buddhist practice under Dogen. And he talks about some other women under Dogen. So Dogen had one of the lucid voices that sounded the philosophical and practical truth of the equality of female and male practitioners amid the cacophony of doubters. How much of his thought was realized in the 700-year history since then? The successor of Dogen, Keizan Joken Zenji, who was from 1268 to 1325, continued Dogen's teachings on equality, and he ordained and taught many women. Keizan learned his religious devotion from his mother, Ekan Daishi. So she's the one I'm emphasizing today. She's in the Japanese women's ancestor lineage. It's not a true lineage because they weren't each other's students, not like the male lineage where we think it's claimed to be an unbroken lineage from Buddha on down. When you read the history, you find a couple dog legs in there. There's a couple places where it's broken. But nonetheless, it was pretty much teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student. In the case of the women, it's not like that. But it's Ekan Daishi. Daishi means great teacher. According to the records, she was a nun who had been the abbess of Jojiji at the time of Gikai's funeral in 1309. Gikai is another famous Zen ancestor. In honor of his mother, Keizan built an amadera. Does anybody know what an amadera is? It must be a place for women to practice. I meant to look it up. Huiji, the first Soto Zen sect, amadera. On October 9th, 1323, he appointed his mother's niece, his cousin, Myosho Ni. Ni means woman. Myosho is her name, as abbess of this temple. This action is a concrete illustration of Keizan's egalitarian practices in support of women. Again, on May 23rd, 1325, Keizan, age 58, vowed to help women in the three worlds in 10 directions in memory of his mother, Ekan Daishi. In the Jokin Hotsuganmon, it is said that Keizan praised Ekan, his mother, for having dedicated her life to teaching Buddhism to women. Keizan inherited her dedication. His disciple Ekkyu was the first nun known to have received a Soto Dharma transmission. To help her overcome the difficulties of Chinese, Keizan rewrote Dogen's explanation of the precepts in the Japanese phonetic syllabary. Is it syllabary or syllabary? So, records indicate that Keizan had about 30 nuns under his leadership. Then she goes through some of the names that are remembered. So that very point that he did her ceremony in street Japanese tells you that they were still using Chinese, which was the court language, even to do these kinds of ceremonies. Now, Dogen was known for writing in Japanese, so that ordinary Japanese who were not trained, educated, and to be able to read Chinese would be like being able to read Latin, I guess. Could study, know what he wrote for them. Keizan was after Dogen, so apparently that custom or that sort of cultural situation carried over past Dogen. Before going on and more into Dogen's comments on Rahe Tokuzui, let's stop there and see if anybody wants to raise any comments or questions around that.
If I recall, your own Dharma transmission, a woman teacher assisted. I'm wondering if you felt anything shift in your sense of Zen in working with Sarah and Barbara Cohn, coming off of Matsuoka Roshi's influence. Did Barbara have much influence in your?
Maybe it was more an affirmation, because Matsuoka Roshi, was born in Japan, came to America when he's, again, Dogen's age, 25, 26, 27, somewhere in there. I met Matsuoka Roshi when I was about that age. And it seems like in your mid-20s, that's when your brain finishes wiring and you become aware of your mortality. So you start looking for Zen, right? Seems to be a common pattern. But Matsuoka Roshi was not, macho masculine. He was black belt judo, but he was very soft, and he was more like, is that judo, the bending of the willow or something? He was very soft and warm and embracing kind of personality, funny sense of humor. He didn't suffer fools gladly. He was, But Barbara Serene Cohen was my preceptor at my formal transmission ceremony with Okamura, Shohaku Okamura performed. And she had been my training teacher, in the sense that I went to her for 90-day Ango in Austin, Texas. And that's where I learned the current way of doing all of these forms and protocols that we're carrying forward as best we can here. Sensei did these, but he didn't really train us in this so much. That was not a big deal for him. It was not as important, say, as Zazen, mainly. And for Serene Barbara Cohn, she came from theatrical background, so she had a little more sense of it, and how to train people in it. But I felt she was like an older sister to me, or like a mothering instinct. And she was very. When you introduced us, Gaksan here introduced us, that she said, "You shouldn't be in this situation. You've been doing this forever, and you're not recognized, and you can't join the SABA. You can't do this or whatever. And let's fix this." She was a problem solver. We can fix this, So I think it was more a reaffirmation. I was surrounded by women my whole life, being raised, and women and men, but I've always been treated very well by the women in my life. And so she was just another person who was just very understanding and very kind to me. And so was Matsuoka. So it wasn't like a shift away from a masculine identity to a feminine identity at all. From me, it's always been, the iconography is like androgynous. The Buddha nature is not gendered, and that's what the point that's being made here is: the Buddha nature is not gendered. So I'm full of X and Y chromosomes, just like all of you, So I may be male more than female, but I don't see that that's an absolute division. And that's where a lot of the new controversy around sexuality and gender is based on the idea that it's a spectrum, and you might be over here and self-identify as male, but so I don't think I had that. I mean, I've had as much trouble with women as any other man in history, I'm sure. But when it came to Zen practice, it didn't seem to have anything to do with gender. If that answers your question, I don't know. Anything else on that?
Well, it occurs to me that Zen in America is mostly interested in daily life. So I'm not aware of not that there aren't, but I'm not aware of situations where men go off and study Zen in the Soto tradition, and women go off and study. It's usually a co-ed type of practice. And finding ways to work well together seems to be part of the practice rather than otherwise.
I think the underlying philosophy is that, but I think if you go to Japan today and you go to the monastery, it's going to be all male. Not all male, but I think, preponderance.
Same
Monks
with
and
the,
male.
I think the Catholic Church still
Yeah.
distinguishes, but part of the revival experiments, social experiments then in America is to see, try to avoid those kinds of problems that come up with separation.
Did you say they're trying to keep it separated?
The Catholic,
Yeah.
I think there's still a separation, right?
Yeah, oh, yeah. That would
Sensei Matsuo Kuroshi used to say, don't mix up Zen. I think he meant don't mix it up with all those kinds of issues. When I first went to Eiheiji, I was a little surprised. We went and sat in the public zendo. There's a statue in the middle, usually the Manjushri statue is out here in the middle of the room, and it looked like Dogen to me. And they had a little shelf with little shoes on it, wood statue. It looked like they were representing Dogen as Manjushri or something in the middle of the room. And the women sat over there, and the men sat over there. I went to a bar mitzvah. It's like that. The men are over there, and the women are over there.
I was just laughing. I find it kind of.
It's telling me there's a board meeting.
Yeah. I find it that trying to separate people causes more issues. It creates more desire. Or if you try to suppress that natural desire, it comes out in kind of.
We've seen that with some televangelists.
Right, it comes out in really weird ways, or it can,
If you make ask something as completely evil,
right,
then it's irresistible.
Right. So I think if we haven't learned anything, or if we learn something, it's to embrace each other and to worship together and be together. And I mean, it's going to happen.
I think last year we read another book, not Women Living Zen, but something like Women in Zen, which was Grace Shireson and a bunch of mostly women, I think, from the Suzuki lineage had banded together, and each one wrote a paper, and they published it all as a group. And we read it in our Tuesday night Dharma, Cloud Dharma. And a lot of the people reading one of them in particular, one of the essays in there, really a lot of pushback, because she was saying that men and women are physically different, have different physiologies and so forth. And most of the training principles were handed down from men to men. And so she was arguing that the way of training, including Zazen, may not be appropriate for women, for men. And so to me, she was coming up against that gender difference again in terms of Buddha nature. But so it's an ongoing debate.
It makes a lot of sense to me to talk about masculine and feminine, or to talk about the problems of sexuality in regards to renunciation, and kind of in talking about craving with regard to sexuality, talking about differences between men and women, the way some of these books are, is like, it seems like a non-issue. I mean, it seems so far out there. Again, something kind of left over from the, it's like having a conversation about whether women should be able to vote. Right. To me, like talking about that now, it seems like, what? Why are we? We're not having that conversation, are we?
Right.
But I mean, like certain parts of the world still.
Right. I mean, well, you talked about the separation in Japan, and I mean that's where they need to be having that conversation. But it seems like having a conversation about actual differences and whether women should be able to practice Zen, like some of these books are talking about, feels so outdated.
Right. Well, there was this guy walking down the beach, sees a bottle, picks it up, rubs it, this genie pops out. Genie says, I'm going to give you one wish, whatever you want. Guy goes, well, I'm completely phobic of flying. I can't get on a plane, but I've always wanted to go to Hawaii. So I want to build a bridge from where we're at right now in California to Hawaii. And so I can drive to Hawaii. And Jeannie looks out over the water and goes, oh man, you're going to put a lot of workers at risk. Think about how much concrete and rebar this is going to take. Tectonic plates are going to pull this thing apart. You're going to disrupt the migratory, pathways of a lot of marine mammals. And I just, you're going to have to think something else. That's just not feasible. So the guy says, okay, all right. All my life, women have been a complete mystery. I want to really understand women. I want to know what they think. I want to know what makes them tick. I want women to make sense to me. Jeannie looks back out over the water and goes, so how many lanes you need on this bridge? Okay, it's like the reverse. Well, timing's perfect. Look at this. Spell is broken. We are no longer just a room full of dudes.
We're talking about women in Zen today.
We're talking about women in Zen. You walk right in.
I hope I can help.
Too late now.
Just being here.
I don't know. The first thing that pops into mind is whenever I teach beginners, the first thing I ask is, what brought you here? And the vast majority of men say they can't control anger. The majority of women say they can't control anxiety. So, you got to ask, okay, what's the difference between the two? And I posit that there really isn't one.
Yeah.
Physiology differences in physiology, I think, are like so minor. And I mean, you look at infants and you really can't tell. You can't tell gender until somebody's about 10 years old, and then you can't tell gender, past 80. I really don't think that we have enough difference here. That should, like Brian said, we're having this conversation again.
By the way, we're talking about people still debating voting rights for women in parts of the world.
Well, a lot of it is.
But this was around. And
Well, it
women
seems
really,
like we're just talking about a lot of different things, right? There's a book that Sensei brought in that's making an argument that that some of the early founders of Zen and whether they were in favor of mixing men and women, or whether they, certain monasteries didn't have women. Like, that's one conversation, which I think is like a non-conversation right now. And then the other conversation, I guess, that we could be having is about masculinity and femininity, and whether there's differences, and whether, with regard to craving, with regard to sexuality, with regard to renunciation, maybe in monastic settings and stuff like that, whether there's a case to be made. I don't know if we're really talking about that, but that's what I'm thinking about, whether there's a case to be made about whether men and women should be separated, just to simplify the practice. Not that they should be separated from the practice, but
Isn't it many times a lot about the culture, like we were just saying a while ago?
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, I was just watching a documentary not too long ago, and it was on Japan, and they pointed out it's still very chauvinistic. I mean, it's still very divided. So over here, you don't see that, because I'm not saying chauvinism is not around. I'm just saying, though, that that's less of an issue. I mean, so I think that, when you talk about women voting, women having the right to do this or that, where they got those rights, I mean, it was a cultural thing over time that changed. Some countries, we look at it, it's like, how can they not have that right now, or that ability? Well, it just seems like it's just the culture that they're in.
So I think so. And, that's what I like to say about Zen is it's not Japanese, it's not Chinese, it's not Indian, it's not American. It can't be captured in a cultural model. It's sort of outside of culture. But I think it informs and reinforces culture in some very positive ways. That's why I think it survived for so long, because generally there's a lot of, in history, if you read the history, you see a lot of complexity, but in general, the monasteries were not directly politically engaged. And so they tended to be where people would go to, they became the universities, right, as they did in Europe. And so I think they survived a lot of the warring times in China and Japan because of that, because they were net asset to society. Anyway, so this is, so I'll have to fill you in later on where we came from. This is the book we were looking at by Paul Rai about women, Zen nuns, and so forth in the history of Zen. Famous teachers in the history of Zen who were women and supporters of Zen. So she refers to this in there. So Rai-hai Tokuzui means, this is the translation by Nishijima Cross, which is pretty much, I think, considered a pretty authoritative translation. A lot of footnotes, very scholarly. Rai-hai means to prostrate oneself to. Toku means to get or to attain, and zui means marrow. So Rai-hai Tokuzui means prostrating oneself to the attainment of the marrow. In other words, revering what has got the truth. In this chapter, Master Dogen preached to us that the value of a being must be decided according to whether or not it has got the truth of a sentient being. So he said, even if it is a child, a woman, a devil, or an animal like a wild fox, it has got the truth. If it has got the truth, we must revere it wholeheartedly. Now, that may be a bridge too far for some of you, prostrating to a fox. In this attitude, we can find Master Dogen's sincere reverence of the truth and his view of men, women, and animals. So I think I can capsulize that a little bit for you by saying that according to the doctrine of Dharma, Dharma means the truth, it means the teaching, it means things. An atom is a Dharma being, it has the connotation of being. So anything that is, say, an insentient being cannot but manifest the Dharma 100%. Sentient beings can get it wrong, and human beings can really screw it up, right? So we're the only ones who can really mess it up badly. But that also means we're the only ones who can really get it fully, right? So we can come to insight because of our capacity for screwing it up. How's that? So that's not I'm not demeaning what Dogen said. I don't want you to interpret it as some sort of animism or something like that. So Dogen goes on to say, having met with a guiding teacher, we should throw away myriad involvements and, without wasting a moment of time, we should strive in pursuit of the truth. And that's really what we're doing. That's what I hope you are all doing here. We get confused here because we have a community, have a sangha, we have a lot of stuff going on, and we think, well, should I get involved in this or that and this or that? This is all we're here to do, actually. That's the simplicity of Zen and the uniqueness of it, I think. Not that others are not striving to get to the truth, but in Zen we insist that that is the only thing. That's not just the most important thing, that is the only thing. Okay. We should strive in pursuit of the truth. We should train with consciousness. We should train without consciousness. There's a good one for you. While you're sleeping, I suppose, right? And we should train with semi-consciousness, which is what most of us are doing, right? Thus, we should learn walking on tiptoes to put out a fire on our head. Now, that means tiptoes is like Buddha was said to have stood on tiptoe for 7 days. And putting out a fire on your head is the intensity of the training. Right? This is one of the images Dogen uses. When we behave like this, we are unharmed by abusive demons. So that takes a little explanation. One of the lines he did not translate from the Chinese Fukan Zazengi, which is a tract on principles of seated meditation that he wrote in Japanese for his students. One of the lines said, as the path grows higher, demons flourish. He chose not to translate that line because he was just translating all the positive aspects and not to give anybody anything to think about, right? But as the path grows higher, demons flourish. That means the closer we get to it, the harder it gets. It's like the last 10 yards of the 100-yard dash, right? So Buddha, the night of his awakening, was assailed by the hordes of Mara, demons, seductresses, the daughters of Mara, coming to, distract him from where he was going. This is where you see this famous statue where he's reaching down, touching the earth. He's certifying, or what would you call it? You know,
Verifying.
confirming, verifying that, no, this is normal, this is natural. You know, this is, he said the last temptation was he was elevated to the status of a god by Mara, the principle, or kind of like a Satan, but not really a being, the principle of Mara, confusion, delusion. Said, no, this, you touch the earth. So that's what we mean by demons. So your demons are maybe different than mine, and maybe given less tangibility than they were in China or Japan at that time. But we're still dealing with demons. So then he quotes Shakyamuni in this regard, saying that sorry. He said is to get free of the secular world and make one's home the state of truth. Now that's what we mean by home leaving. So you don't literally have to leave home. You make your home the state of truth, no matter where you are. Then if we attach even slightly more weight to self-regard for the body than to the Dharma is not transmitted to us, and we do not attain the truth. This is why he was willing to put his life on the line. Okay. So it is said that those who attach weight to the Dharma will make the body and mind into a seat on the floor. Here we are. And will serve for countless kalpas. Whatever is maintaining and relying upon the great Dharma, whatever has got my marrow, whether it is an outdoor pillar, the insentient in other words, whether it is a stone lantern, whether it is the Buddhas, or whether it is a wild dog, a demon, or a god, a man, or a woman. Kodo Sawaki Roshi, who was Uchiyama's teacher, who was Okumura's teacher, was famous for saying that his greatest teacher was this pillar that he sat in front of in the Zendo. He followed that pillar. He caught him. That was his teacher. Bodies and minds are easily received. They are as common as in the world as rice, flax, bamboo, and reeds. The Dharma is rarely met. Shakyamuni Buddha says, when you meet teachers who expound the supreme state of Bodhi, meaning wisdom, have no regard for their race or caste. Do not notice their looks, do not dislike their faults, and do not examine their deeds. Only because you revere their prajna means wisdom, let them eat hundreds and thousands of pounds of gold every day, serve them by presenting heavenly food, serve them by scattering heavenly flowers, do prostrations and venerate them 3 times every day, and never let anxiety or annoyance arise in your mind. He's talking about teachers, your attitude towards teachers who are expounding, and he criticizes teachers who are phonies. So don't get Dogen wrong here. And Shakyamuni is doing the same thing. Since I established the mind, Shakyamuni is talking about himself. Since I established the mind, I have been practicing like this. And so today I have been able to attain Anattara Samyaksambodhi, complete enlightenment and so forth. This being so, Dogen says, we should hope that even trees and stones might preach to us. We should request that even fields and villages might preach to us. We should question outdoor pillars, and we should investigate even fences and walls. So that's where he comes off saying all things are engaged in Buddha activity. Earth, grass, trees, walls, tiles, and pebbles, all engage in Buddha activity. In one of the famous lines. So long ago in the Tang Dynasty, great master Shinshai of Joshu established the mind and set off as a wayfarer. In the story he says, I shall question anyone who is superior to me, even a child of 7. And I shall teach anyone who is inferior to me, even a child of 100. So isn't there a Western philosophical statement like that? Some philosopher made about learning from a child, and the Greek philosophers maybe. Okay. Just a little bit more. A leader of monks must always rely upon clear eyes, yet many leaders are drowning the body mind of a village bumpkin. Sounds like he's talking today. Not naming names. They are so dense that they are prone to be derided even in the secular world. How much less do they deserve to be mentioned in the Buddha Dharma? So he's talking critically about leaders of Buddhism at that time. Moreover, there may be men who would refuse to prostrate themselves to women monks who are teachers that have received the Dharma, and who are the men's elder sisters, aunts, and so on. Because they do not know and will not learn, they are close to animals and far from the Buddhist patriarchs. So I think that's enough. These talks, by the way, are only meant to introduce you to these teachings, hoping that you will follow and go and get the book out of the library and read, right? Because I could sit here and read that whole fascicle to you, and it would take like 3 hours, 2 hours or something long. But it would all be worth hearing. So let's do that, however, and then open the floor to discussion. How are we doing on time? About 5 minutes? 10? Cool. Don't make me call you out. There he goes.
So you use the word truth.
Use the word
Truth.
truth.
What do you? How do you describe the truth, or
Board me.
this truth that is central to our being here? How do you?
We wouldn't be here
describe
if
that?
we wouldn't be here if we had it. Right? I mean, we're here because we think Dharma has something to do with it. We're hoping to get clear up some confusion that we may have in that regard, right? The truth in Zen or Buddhism is experiential, and so it cannot be gotten in words. Although many times in these stories they say, and all 17, of her, the people who listened to this woman teacher were enlightened by what she had to say, and so forth. We think enlightenment is, we're already enlightened. We're enlightened to the fact that something is missing in our life and we're looking for it. And you can call it the truth if you want. You can say I'm looking for the truth. Often when we find the truth, it's not what we want. So the truth has, a double-edged sword. It's not always pleasant. But the truth with a capital T, I guess, referred to in these teachings, is something that you can only experience. And even then, you have to put quotes around the word experience. Master Dogen described it in the Zazen Shen, intimacy without defilement. The intimacy without defilement is dropping off without relying on anything, that kind of terminology. Intimacy in the sense of the water to the fish. It's so close in time and space that there's no two in it. So it's not two. So there's not something experiencing something. And so it's intimate because it can't be shared. It can't be given to anybody else. They have to find it themselves. Matsuoka Roshi used to say, your enlightenment is yours and mine is mine. You can't get mine, I can't get yours. So when it comes to the truth, we try to express the truth, yes. But in Zen, expression is seen as a far distant second to experience. Experience is the only thing that matters. And when you start to say, well, in this experience there is not two, then it's not conventional experience. This is why it cannot be defiled. It cannot be brought down to ordinary experience. Does that make sense? If we all had this truth, you might still be here, but you might be here for other reasons. You might be here for the benefit of the community rather than for yourself. or both, it's for both. I think Buddhism is neither selfish nor selfless. There's no self in it. So the things we do for Buddhism, quote unquote, are for ourselves, but they're also for others simultaneously. No dichotomy. So truth is like that, I think. Non-dual. It's not something some of us have and others don't. We all have it.
Thank you.
Still unclear? I'm not clear on this myself. Buddha didn't understand this.
Maybe tying the discussion back toward center toward sex or gender. We talked about simplicity earlier, about dividing gender by simplicity.
Yeah.
And I think to me that appears silly in the practice.
Silly?
It's silly in the practice because of the sense of like we're all laity right here. If we really wanted simplicity in our practice, we would become monks and we would try to live. We would try to live a simple life, but we do not. And I think it's sort of like maybe an alcoholic or recovering alcoholic just banning all images of alcohol or any presence. Like the power is already, that's the power holding you. You're not free from alcohol by not being around alcohol at all. It's quite the opposite. And I think that applies the same to division through gender.
Yeah, I think so.
So you're saying it's easier if you are not tempted by having women around, that makes it something, then you can focus more on your practice.
I think probably that essentially say like enlightenment is something you're working towards. You would have to get over that hurdle eventually of being around other people that you're sexually attracted to, and you're forcing a stumbling block for yourself if you are still holding on to that, I guess. I don't, that's really hard to like converse in this conversation.
Couple things around that. Ramakrishna was a Hindu saint. He was like, I call it ecumenical Christian Buddhist and so 1850s Calcutta said in the beginning, you have to you grow a maple sapling or an oak tree. The sapling has to have a fence around it so the elephants don't trample it in India, Calcutta. And he said, but eventually it is so strong, the oak grows to be such a strong, huge tree that even an elephant can't push it over. So you'd have to look at time of life and where you are in your practice, and are you still hormonal? Have you gotten past that stage? You know, have you read Schopenhauer and understand that you're really fulfilling the desire of the species and not your personal desire? And all those kind of things. So there's a maturation process that's going on at the same time. You can't sort of isolate it and say in concrete, casting concrete for all circumstances, as mentioned here, in different circumstances. Dogen was teaching differently in different cases, different conditions, as was Buddha. Buddha taught differently for different audiences, different circumstances, but because you have to take into the context into account. So yes, of course, if you're driven crazy by the situation you live in, then getting off to a monastery for a while might be just the ticket. Right? But if your practice is dependent on anything, as Dogen says, without relying on anything, if your practice is dependent on being only with people of your own gender, and how do you know they're not homosexual? And so does that really take sexuality out of the equation just by being males being with males? No. If it's dependent on anything like that, it's not genuine. It's not yet genuine practice. It's not exactly phony. You know, like you have to be able to woodshed if you're going to be a musician. You have to be able to get away by yourself and practice and practice and practice. And then when you come back and play with a group, you're not going to embarrass yourself, right? So I think it's that simple a principle, that this is like more pedagogy. It's more practical, that you know, release yourself from these kinds of distractions in order to really get somewhere, and maybe once you get somewhere, you can come back into reality. So the ox herding pictures are like that. It shows the guy capturing the ox and training the ox, and so and there's the big empty circle, and he comes back into the village with bliss bestowing hands. Now he can come back into society and have something to offer. Right? So there's this meme that you have to go away and go up on the mountain like Jesus and Buddha did, and 40 days, 40 nights, and come back, you know, and then you'll be ready. But if your practice is absolutely dependent on that, it can't be the real thing, right? Because you're separating yourself from reality in order to have a practice.
I mean, it seems like lay practice is a gradual. I mean, if you're sincere about your practice, there's a gradual renunciation that happens, where you sort of give things up that don't serve your practice over time. Whereas if you go join a monastery, it's kind of like it's externally enforced. Like the renunciation is severe and it's all at one time. And it kind of seems like, back to the elephant analogy, it sort of seems like the monastery is like planting your tree somewhere where there aren't elephants. And the lay practice is sort of deciding, no, I think I'm tired of being trampled by elephants, so I'm going to kind of put a fence in here. I'm going to create my life in such a way that I can grow, where I don't have to worry about the things that are getting in the way of my practice. And I think it's a lot more complicated, as you mentioned. We're not extricating ourselves from complexity and complications in a lay practice. I think that's a long conversation.
But the truth is, you bring your elephants with you. Yeah. And there's story after story about monks in monastic settings where that's true. Well, let me say one more thing about Dogen's view on that. He said there's four levels of monks, something like that. So the first is not able to do renunciation in the physical sense. They're not able to actually leave their family behind, give up their name, give up their inheritance, and really join. Really leave all that behind and move into this. And then he said the next level of monk can do that. They can actually relinquish all of that, and but cannot give up their attachment to their health. They cannot put their life at risk for the sake of this great matter, or whatever. And then he said the third monk can also do that. They can put themselves at risk of death or suffering, sickness, and so forth, for the sake of this insight and getting what we're trying to get here. But he said the highest level of monk can also give up his own or her own opinion of all that, of everything. That third level of monk who can give up, do physical renunciation, do life renunciation, can still not give up their own opinion, their own mind. So the highest level of monk can relinquish even that. And so where does that leave you? To me, that leaves you with lay practice. That leaves you where, you know what, I need to get away from this for a while, but I am not proud of the fact that I can give up, that I can do physical renunciation and go put on the haircloth, shirt, and join the monastery and become a monk. If you're proud of that, that's not true renunciation. So it's almost like what's really going on inside monk, outside monk, right? But being a monk has nothing to do with outer appearance, in other words, outer circumstance. This is why lay practice was so highly admired throughout the history of Zen. Are we over time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, why don't we do the same 3 bows, stop, and we do the 4 vows 3 times. And then the last line, you did it twice.
Beings are numberless, I vow to freedom. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are countless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to freedom. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Meanings are numberless. I vow to freedom. Illusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it.
Thank you for your patience and listening. I hope that wasn't too scrambled. Thank you. Any of you would like to read